All right, so we are going to get started here. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Denise Rowland, and I am the Eastern Regional Coordinator for the Ontario Centre for Workforce Innovation, or OCWI. I want to first off thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is a first for OCWI that is amongst a series of webinars we'll be hosting over the course of the winter and early spring that will highlight and share best practices of a variety of projects and initiatives. We have folks from around the province tuning in today, so thanks again for taking the time out of your busy days to join us and to learn more about the Law Foundation project and from our speakers. At OCWI, we drive change in the Ontario employment and training sector. We work with agencies and other partners that build skills, provide training, and connect people looking for jobs with employers looking for workers. Together, we improved outcomes for workers and employers across the province. We focus on our research by using innovation and evaluation to identify and test solutions to workforce development challenges. We share knowledge with the community by translating research results into information and tools that can easily be accessed, understood, and used. And we focus on capacity building by providing learning opportunities and training to implement evidence-informed approaches. We are joined today by Madeline Nuremberg, Program Manager, and Carl Flecker, Immigration Employment Specialist, both from Keys Job Center in Kingston. Madeline is the manager responsible for newcomer services at Keys in Kingston, overseeing creative, culturally competent, and solution-focused employment and language resettlement services. Madeline emphasizes an anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, and strengths-based approach to client service and advocacy, as well as a horizontal approach to management. She has coached employment services staff from across Ontario in effective service delivery to newcomers and championed the development of quality services for newcomers in Kingston. Carl is an immigrant employment specialist with Keys as well. He has extensive experience in workplace and human rights, occupational health and safety, labor migration, and immigration policy. He earned the title of Labor Expert from the United Nations Global Forum on Migration and Development and is an accomplished facilitator, writer, and researcher. So today, Madeline and Carl will lead us through a discussion as we learn about why this project came to be using a number of contemporary data points and issues that affect newcomers' entry and access to law and justice in the workplace. The methodology that project used and some of the content we covered as it pertains to newcomers and the ESA, OH&S Acts, as well as employment aspects of IRPA. Finally, we will look at an important and growing issue of concern, the role of racial and religious profiling workplaces and implication for newcomers and settlement agencies alike. So I invite you all to participate in some live polling questions that we'll be hosting throughout the presentations. They'll just pop up on your screen if you could just reply honestly, and we'll speak to those. We'll also be discussing a few case studies, and we welcome you to use the chat function to engage with us on those. We'll then be answering some more general questions towards the end of the session, so please do write them in the Q&A on this platform, and we'll get to them when we do. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to also use the chat function and we'll try to address them. So to get things started, we're going to start with our first poll. So I'm just going to release that to you now. So as you see on your screen, there are 5 questions that are coming up. So if you could all take a moment to answer those, and we will get to them. So again, if you see the polling questions come up on your screen, just please answer those, and we're going to refer back to them in a moment. So just another about 20 seconds there, and then we'll be sharing the results back. All right, so I'm going to share the results with you all.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Madeline Nierenberg from Keys Job Center.
Carl Flecker here from Keys as well.
So thanks for answering those questions. We see that the majority of listeners on the call work with newcomers looking for work and have some familiarity with employment standards, human rights, and occupational health and safety. We're really happy to see that. And that many of you and the majority of you have seen that there are infractions and violations of these laws that impact newcomers and their employment.
Great, okay. And for those of you who have not picked the yes box, that's totally cool as well. Hopefully we'll be able to share some information that's valuable to everybody on the webinar.
So to begin, we're gonna get into a number of areas of sort of data points that point to why we decided to move forward with the Law Foundation project. So first, just going to talk a little bit about demographics, and these might be this might be some information you've heard before. Canada has an aging population, so we're one of many countries experiencing a growing number of elders and a slowing birth rate. As you can see here, about 127 out of just under 200 states are not able to replace their population through natural childbirth, and Canada is one of them. Recently, the Conference Board of Canada released a report that reinforced how significant and largely global this change is, and it's been underway for some time, and it's impacting population as a whole and specifically labor force. And so essentially, with not being able to replace labor force with birth rates, our country is basically relying on incoming newcomers for labor force replacement. Another report that was recently shared actually through Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada was a news bulletin from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. And this bulletin indicates that almost half of small businesses who responded to a survey are experiencing skills shortages. Similarly, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce wrote about 4 years ago, and they wrote an immigration policy that reflected that 30% of their members were having difficulty filling job openings. And unfortunately, though, this same survey indicated that only 7% of small and medium-sized enterprises in Ontario are actually using our immigration system for hiring purposes. So though there is a skills shortage, there is a labor shortage, many employers are not taking advantage of newcomers to fill those shortages, and there's a disconnect between the broader need of the labor market and the behavior of employers within the labor market. So we see employers are not using the immigration system, and therefore we have our doubts as to how well versed employers are and how ready they are to address issues related to workplace rights, entitlements, and occupational health and safety protections for newcomers.
Great. And I think that's reinforced just by the poll that we did initially, showing that a number of you are familiar with this reality. Newcomers disproportionately end up in precarious, low-wage jobs. They tend to be physically demanding jobs, and in many cases, they offer few, if any, benefits. So we're just going to pop up with another polling question to see if that is a familiar story for your agency as well. So if we can just throw that polling question up. I'll repeat, is this a familiar story? That newcomers that you're dealing with end up in precarious, low-wage jobs that tend to be physically demanding, offer few of any benefits. Is that familiar to you? Yes, no, or unsure? We'll just give that a few more seconds and then we'll tabulate the results on that question. Normally we just ask for hands in the audience, but downside of tech. Yeah, so a very strong familiarity. That's great. Thank you for that, folks. So we just wanted to share some research that was conducted by the Ontario Ministry of Labour as part of its Changing Workplace Review found that between 2010 and 2016, wage theft by employers totaled just roughly $50 million. And just to be clear, wage theft includes wrongful paycheck deductions, the holding back of a worker's wage for customer theft or shortages at the till, withholding a worker's wages claiming their performance was not up to an employer's arbitrary standard, or failure to pay the minimum wage or holiday or vacation pay or training periods, or to charge illegal workplace fees. And since 2009, the Ministry of Labour has recovered just 19 million out of 47.5 million that was stolen from workers through these types of wage theft. And Leo Bosco, a lead researcher and professor at York University for the Changing Workplace Review Task Force, noted that this is an alarmingly low success rate, and the prosecution rate for employers guilty of these monetary violations was less than 0.02%. So also, go ahead.
So just point out that unfortunately a few of our slides are in the wrong order, so you may see me jumping back and forth, but this one matches with what we're going to talk about next, which is essentially that newcomers face a very high risk of occupational health and safety issues in the workplace, particularly of serious injuries. So the Institute for Work and Health organized a series of focus groups for newcomers to share their experience finding employment and in the workplace in Kingston, as well as in other communities across the province. Respondents who had found employment shared experiences of being underpaid, being asked to do unsafe work, and or being unaware of their workplace rights. In 2011, the first ever study examining the relationship between workplace injuries and education to job mismatch revealed that recent immigrants who have higher educational qualifications than required for the job are actually more than 3 times as likely to report a workplace injury as an immigrant with 5 years experience in the country who is not overqualified for the job. Research has shown that 90% of immigrant workplace injuries require medical attention, compared to 65% for other workers. So what we're seeing here is that newcomers not only face a greater risk of injury, but that the injury is also more serious. So given that about half of recent immigrants end up working in jobs for which they are overqualified, means not only that our economy is underutilizing their talent, but that people are at risk of both physical workplace injury and harmful mental well-being. A researcher from the Institute for Work and Health, Cynthia Chen, points out that immigrants receive very little information when applying to come to Canada about what type of work they are likely to end up in, and how long they may have to remain in jobs for which they are overqualified. Of this situation, she says, and this is a quote, "Our study shows that unmet job expectations increases the risk of decline in mental well-being over a relatively short time."
Thanks, Madeline. That's quite important for those of us who responded to that question about helping folks get into survival jobs. That piece of research is something we should keep in mind. So where are newcomers immigrating from? I just ask you to close your eyes and color in the dominant faces you might find in these regions of the world as you see this slide. Imagine the dominant religions from these source countries or regions of the world where Canada is receiving the bulk of our immigrants. With 80% of newcomers to Canada arriving from predominantly racialized regions of the world, and where dominant faiths may differ from Christian patterns that were part of Canada's settlement process, what might be the implications for newcomers entering our workforce? How might newcomers' workplace rights and entitlements be impacted with this color coding that is a reality?
Now, of course, we are also aware that we're in a moment of global crisis. According to the United Nations, and this is not from yesterday, this has been going on, we're facing the largest migration crisis since the end of the Second World War. There are well over more than 65 million people who've been forced from their homes and are seeking a safe way to be. We see crises in Syria, also in South Sudan, in Yemen, on the brink of huge famine, in Haiti and across the Caribbean and Latin America. People are fleeing from their homes to seek livable lives. In Kingston, we've been fortunate. We've welcomed over 250 government-assisted refugees, as well as privately sponsored individuals. And of course, there are asylum seekers and undocumented folks in our communities and in your communities as well. Over half of refugees are children, and we're facing famine, as mentioned. So, this is a context in which we're doing our work. We're, working with newcomers on employment, working with newcomers in settlement. But what about those individuals whose status is insecure? What about people who are on work permits? Does our programming allow for us to support these individuals? And when it does, are we prepared as professionals to help newcomers navigate issues related to status, work permits, and these types of issues, specifically for individuals who may be working and at risk of not being able to remain in Canada? Are we able to refer them to apply for humanitarian and compassionate leave to be able to stay? And more broadly, are we prepared to engage with politicians who are misrepresenting the situation, building on the xenophobia within our communities in the pursuit of nationalism and narrowly defined political power? How do we know about the law in this broken world?
Thanks, Madeline. So another point that came to our attention was the notion of race. Now, Canada doesn't keep race-based data on the number of temporary work permit holders. When I worked at the Canadian Labour Congress, I used source country immigration data, and I was able to show that this specific category of newcomers, temporary foreign worker permit holders, are disproportionately and predominantly racialized. In 2007, there were more than 60%. That's much higher now. And they also, of course, originate from low-income countries and regions of the world. Our own records for 2016-2017 showed a very large percentage of our clients were racialized. Nearly 60% identified as women, and on average, 25% of our clients were holding temporary or work-study permits. And this is something that we've been seeing an increase of as it relates back to immigration policy. Again, a significant percentage of these were live-in caregivers who are also racialized. Now, this data is relevant, or this demographic profile, because if we want to build staff and community capacity to better advocate for racialized newcomers and or women, then we need to understand the context that they are operating in and how the law treats them. It also means we need to have a better understanding of the law and how systemic discrimination operates in employment. Now, since 9/11, there's been a significant increase in the use of security clearance protocols as a conditional component of employment hiring processes in a number of sectors. This is often based on racial and religious profiling, and to be frank, is utterly discriminatory. Now, this includes in marine and air transport sectors, military and civil use related technologies, including space related technologies, satellite telecommunications, and cryptography, as well as manufacturers and exporters and brokers of defense articles, defense services, or related technical data. More employers now adhere to or employ some form of security clearance protocols for their workforce. The federal government requires employers in the marine transport sector to adhere to something called the Marine Transport Security Regulations, which has very specific implications for newcomers. When you stop and think that 40% of Canadian dock workers are actually dual citizens, those security rules will have a huge impact on people's ability to work. Airports, the same thing. They have hiring and monitoring security protocols. Firms that carry cargo over the US-Canada border, particularly since 9/11 and the implementation of the federal government's Smart Border Program, have modified internal human resource practices for many employers. This includes an increase in internal transfers or shift swapping, so that drivers who are racialized and or prone to being religiously profiled at the border, therefore being detained, searched, interrogated by CBSA or ICE, are increasingly been giving domestic runs rather than cross-border shifts. In fact, we documented that some trucking firms explicitly sought to recruit white drivers for cross-border traffic in order to avoid delays at the border crossings and affect profitability of their companies. We are witnessing a tremendous securitization of the workplace. The federal and Ontario governments both use security clearance programs as part of their hiring practices, creating additional hurdles for newcomers, as well as for racialized applicants who are part of our national labor force. The Public Service Commission of Canada and the provincial government also use employment-related security protocols in their human resource practices. And we see impediments for newcomers seeking employment with the Ontario Public Service, as well as from international students who are looking for internships or employment opportunities in aerospace, for example, or with the federal public service. Now, this slide that you're seeing here documents just a few cases of employment-based profiling in workplaces. In addition, the new federal security clearance processes typically take 2 to 8 weeks for a clearance to be issued. But that's if the job seeker has not spent time out of Canada or if fingerprints are not required. But if job seekers have lived outside of Canada in the past 5 years, that security clearance process can increase to well over a year. This security clearance timeline and the related fingerprint requirements clearly disadvantage newcomers and signals inequality. The variety of employment conditions security clearance programs noted above are creating a new series of employment hurdles for some citizens, permanent residents, and certain newcomers based on country of origin and or racial or religious profiling practices in the workplace. Now, all of these issues that we've touched on just in the last few minutes inform our legal education project.
And before we, next we're going to move into outlining the legal education project and the specific content, but just want to get a sense from folks, if they're with us and if what you've heard now is resonating with you so far. So I'm going to ask that we've launched another polling question. So, what we've been talking about so far, does this resonate with you? Invite you again, just to answer yes, no, or unsure. And we'll have the time, of course, to ask questions at the end. So if some of these issues if you have questions about them, we'll do our best to answer them. So just give you another 30 seconds. Okay, so I think that we're going to close the poll and everyone can see the results. So yeah, overwhelmingly, I think what we're talking about is not dramatically, new information, and it matches the realities that you're seeing in your workplaces and your communities. So that's great to see.
Thanks very much, and we'll talk to the two of you where it doesn't resonate later. So let me just talk a little bit about the project, the Law Foundation of Ontario Community Connections. I came across this grant program because, like so many of us in the settlement sector, even though we're really well paid and well resourced, we're always looking for extra cash. Sarcasm. And so over a number of months of working with the LFO Community Connection staff, and in this context of what we were seeing at the front lines in terms of our clients, we said we'd really like to devise a legal education project where we could train folks. But very specific, we wanted our target audience to get legal education targeted to frontline service providers and to community leaders from specific newcomer, ethno-racial, or cultural communities. Our thinking was we didn't want to just increase the capacity of frontline staff. We knew that in some cases, newcomers turn for advice to people within their own community. And we wanted to improve that capacity about the legal situation in Ontario amongst that community and to forge alliances between frontline service providers and community leaders. We then also recruited nearly a dozen of Canada's experienced lawyers in human rights and immigration law. We recruited skilled advocates at the Workers' Action Centre, Institute for Work and Health, and the Centre for Research and Action on Race Relations based in Montreal, FONEMI, some of you may know of this individual. And we asked them to serve as our on-site resource people, as well as to back up our legal competencies. We partnered with Pro Bono Canada, and we recruited a dozen first-year law students to conduct the research, and we trained them in how to deliver interactive content rather than lecture style. And I'll admit that one of my sidebar objectives actually with working with the first-year law students was to actually prevent them from getting jobs on Bay Street in corporate Canada and to see the excitement and poverty wages they would experience working in public policy law. And I'm happy to report that two of them have chosen to work in that area. So based on our awareness of ESA violations, increased risk that newcomers face around OH&S concerns, the growth in the number of newcomers on work permits, the global migration crisis, and the rise of racial and religious profiling that accompanies an anti-immigrant animus, this all informed us on which specific areas of law we wanted to focus on. Now, we used a variety of adult education techniques to be able to talk about the law because we knew that speaking about legal concepts could put a lot of people to sleep really quickly. So we devised our sessions to have games, resource people, case studies, role plays, and we always made sure we had prizes and fantastic food available. Just to give you a sense here, some of the activities we did, we took simple quotes like an injury to one is an injury to all, broke that quote up into specific words, scattered them in an envelope, and people had to put the quote together. You'll see on the slide some other examples. The Where Do You Stand activity was actually a case study of a worker's situation of workplace employment standards violations. And then we would ask people whether or not they perceived the violation to be taking place. And they literally had to position themselves along the line on the floor. Then we asked them to make an intervention, a supportive intervention to assist that worker in that situation, and ask them a question, would that help or would it hurt? And again, literally they had to move their body along the continuum. The point of these activities was to take some challenging concepts and make it more participatory. So let's just take a look at a few case studies that we also used, and we'll give you a chance to read this first one. And we'll invite you to respond to the questions on the bottom using the chat feature, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion around that. We'll bear with us. This format is a challenging way to do this, but let's see if we can do it. So I'll let you read case study number 1. we just go to the...
Yeah, so I think people are thinking through this case study. We have some responses. Not going to read the case study out loud because I think you've taken a look, but here are some possible responses to Sakshi.
So in order to stay in Canada, we would consider the humanitarian and compassionate application as probably her best option.
And so the humanitarian and compassionate application is an avenue for individuals to get permanent resident status in Canada based on, usually it is an application of last resort when someone is not eligible or has been deemed ineligible as a refugee or through another stream, and is about an individual's connections to the community. So in this situation, Sakshi having a child would be, a Canadian child would be one of the reasons that the agency would be suitable.
And in terms of how we might respond as an agency, obviously a referral to a lawyer would be one of the things to consider, but that can also be quite pricey in terms of filing those applications. But one of the things that we found at our agency is to assist the individual by doing some of the documentation, listening to the individual story, helping them to collect the documents that a lawyer would be seeking to support their claim. And that can all be part of the file. And so in our Law Foundation project, we were able to understand the process steps from the legal side, but we were also able to see how our frontline service provider might be able to work with the community that is supporting Sakshi in this particular situation to help with the documentation that will strengthen her case.
And of course, in this situation, we'd also want to be aware that this individual could be in harm's way. So she might need connection to services to ensure her safety, such as a shelter. And then, that referral might not be so simple. It might not just be giving a flyer. What about language issues? What about cultural issues? An individual might be hesitant or unfamiliar to turn to a shelter. Is there a shelter in your community that has experience working in an intercultural context with newcomers who are also facing legal status issues?
So I'll just add as well, one of the things we found when we did this workshop is many people were unfamiliar with the agency application process. But when we laid out the specific steps, they could see very quickly as a frontline service provider what role they could add to the process. We also were interested in learning that there are some legal precedents that have expanded the interpretation of agency applications, and that could be something that we could use to our advantage. And also, to be frank, there is a political component with agency applications because it is at the discretion of the minister. So in addition to what Madeline is saying about being mindful of the particular client's emotional and supportive needs, there is a public education and advocacy component that can improve the situation. And that suggests different areas in which agencies and/or community groups that have a vested interest in policy can play a public education role.
So we have another case study, so we're going to move on to it. And I think so that you don't have to do too much reading, I'll read it out to you and you can read it on your screen. Ali just moved to Canada from Iran with his whole family. He has a master's degree in economics from the University of Tehran, and he's an expert in his field and more than qualified for a job he just recently applied for at Statistics Canada. You helped him write an excellent resume and cover letter. Due to the federal government's new security screening rules for all public service employees, Ali has to go through what is called a reliability status screening, which includes a credit history check. Because he is new to Canada, he does not have a credit score. In addition, Ali has close family in northern Iraq, and his wife holds an Iraqi passport. Ali is also selected for enhanced screening because of the situation in the Middle East, though enhanced screening is only supposed to be conducted in limited and specific circumstances. This enhanced screening includes a law enforcement inquiry to check if the individual has a criminal record, outstanding warrants, or is associated with blacklisted groups or groups known to engage in organized crime, a security interview to assess an individual's reliability and or loyalty to Canada, and open source inquiry to assess an individual's reliability and loyalty to Canada. So another factor is that many members of Ali's wife's family are politically active within the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, which the Canadian government and many other governments, though not the United Nations, officially lists as a terrorist organization. During Ali's enhanced security screening, he's questioned about these transactions and his family ties to the PKK. He's also asked about his loyalty to Canada and to explain the reason that he sent funds to his father-in-law, because he's supporting his family members. After all of this, and it's quite some time and travel for interviews and preparation for interviews and security screening, Ali is unsuccessful in his job application to work with Statistics Canada. So this was a case study that we included in one of our sessions, and we've got some discussion questions that we would share, invite you to share your thoughts. What do you think might be going on in this scenario? Have you ever heard of this reliability or enhanced reliability screening process that the federal government uses for all of its employees within the federal bureaucracy? And how would you advise Ali about his options? And while you're thinking that through, I'll invite Carl to give us some answers to these questions.
So hopefully some of you might find a lot of familiarity with this case study, or you might be saying, holy cow, that's a complex series of factors that are taking place there. But what we wanted to demonstrate here is this is rooted in the real. We are increasingly seeing this level of complexity that quite often is beyond some of our training and capacity and experience, but it is becoming much more commonplace, and it's affecting our ability to provide quality service for newcomers. So this is a tough one, and this is also a situation where the law has not caught up with the reality of the situation. So some potential things that we have found in this particular case is advising Ali with legal counsel to pursue a human rights complaint, because there is discrimination, we believe, taking place based on country of origin. We also took a look at filing a complaint with the union that is representing the workers in this particular situation. And in this particular case, we actually were able to make contact with PIPS, the union representing these government workers, to be able to say, even though Ali has not yet joined the union, this level of security screening for workers who are already in the union has a potential discriminatory impact. And that should mean that that union would be interested in filing a policy grievance on behalf of not only its workforce, but the people who may potentially come into the workforce. There's also the possibility of taking a look at the Canadian Labour Code, because this would have jurisprudence on this particular sector. And for those of you who are experienced with union collective agreements, there is always what I refer to as the happy camper clause in a collective agreement, which starts off with some preambular language about we're all going to get along and we're all going to do the right thing. It is possible to use that language in a Canadian Labour Code complaint and say discrimination is taking place. And lastly, this is a situation where we might be looking to the opposition parties to be able to say, we want to create greater public inquiry and concern with the direction our policies are headed and the impacts that it is having on newcomers, and to ask for debate in the House.
So I think that, from some of our suggestions, you can see that, the position that we are taking here at Keys and within our team is that in order to really effectively assist our clients with their settlement issues, with their employment issues, there are actually some structural barriers that require advocacy at a higher level. And so that's the reason that we've indicated in terms of what we can do. It's all about legal advocacy work in this situation. However, from the personal perspective, I also want to highlight that when dealing with someone who's gone through this type of thing, there is an emotional, and same with the situation with Sakshi, and I think it was maybe more evident in that case study, there is an enormous psychological and emotional toll that our clients face, in particular going through security screenings. And, you know, for those of you who have taken a plane and gone through the security screening at an airport, you can imagine how that can be enlarged and targeted to someone's very being, their country of origin, their family ties, everything that they are as a person, all of a sudden is being oriented as a threat. And the government of Canada, that they've decided to come to Canada, the government of Canada is basically implying through all this screening that they are a threat to the country. And that, you know, it's a pretty direct implication. And that has a very deep psychological and emotional toll that employment advisors and job developers and settlement workers should also be prepared to support, you know, through empathy and understanding and recognizing that when a client that's gone through this, you know, gets really frustrated and angry and maybe does things that aren't in their best interest anymore, that there's a reason for that, and we have to be kind of prepared to coach people through that. One thing that we've done at Keys is we've provided opportunities for newcomers to connect with one another, especially newcomers who are struggling through regulatory bodies, maybe not only because of security issues, but just because of the other structural barriers of regulatory bodies, so that they can share their struggles. And that might not lead to a different outcome, specifically employment-wise, but the camaraderie of that shared experience, has a real difference in their life.
Thank you, Matt. I can't emphasize enough about the importance of both tackling the policy systemic side and the personal side of this. And the clients who are in these situations, the alleys, the scenarios that we're talking about here, they often come back and are very appreciative that the space has been created to tell their story. There is a realism that while they might not win their particular case, they might not get justice, but they get some form of remedy.
So we have another case study here, but I think that, for the sake of time, we're just going to skip it and going to show you some really pretty images. And we're going to ask our colleagues at OCWI to share the presentation with you later, so you'll have the chance to review the case study that we skipped, and contact us if you want more information.
So what we did here, and what you're seeing up on the screen for each of the workshops that we did, we had a graphic recorder on site who did live recording and creating of the art on an 8-foot by 3.5-foot art easel. And this was a really great way to engage participants during the session. It helped to distill the key learning points. It allowed for different learning approaches, particularly when we're talking about complexity of the law, and it enabled a high degree of accessibility. It also meant that we were able to communicate the project to a wider audience when we took these banners to the street at various festivals and events. Participants were able to take the images back to their workplaces digitally, which enabled more sharing amongst their peers and community members because of the novel recording method. More interesting, I think, than circulating written notes or a dense educational manual. Finally, we went another step further and we converted the graphic capture method and created an 8-page comic that shares the stories of employment struggles of 4 different newcomers. Marvel Comics definitely had an influence on me here. So this crew in the storyline of 4 newcomers, they come together, they benefit from collective education and empowerment with the assistance of settlement agency outfits, and they asserted their workplace rights, and to some degree were able to succeed in achieving remedy, if not always justice. The comic also has a resource page to be able to provide supports to newcomers to assert their workplace rights and entitlements. Now, so far, we've translated the comic into French, Spanish, Mandarin, Persian, Arabic, Gurundi, and next will be Hindi. And now unions are stepping up with offers to print, distribute, and expand the project in order to build greater solidarity alliance between newcomers, unions, and settlement agencies that are all working with the new labor force. So that gives you a quick summary of our project, and now is the opportunity to turn to some questions and comments. hope you found this interesting.
So thank you so much for your interest. We have, a bit of time left now. So if you have questions about the what we've presented about this project or about the types of situations that we face, we are very happy to answer them. So you can just type them into the Q&A or to the chat section of your presentation, and we are on standby to answer them. Okay, so we have Jocelyn asking where the comic book can be accessed. So we have hard copies of the comic book, and some of them are at the printer right now. And we will have some at some upcoming conferences. So if you are going to be at the OCASI Executive Directors Forum next week, check us out there. If you're going to be at Pathways to Prosperity in Montreal at the end of the month, or the Canadian Council for Refugees Conference in Montreal at the end of the month, or the Connexus Conference in January. Otherwise, we plan to have e-versions on our website probably in the new year. And you can contact us directly to order copies.
Yeah, I think it might even be sooner than the new year because we got to get this done. But Jocelyn, if you want copies, you can also just email us. Our address is up there, and you can let us know. And when the print run comes off the press, be happy to put some in the mail for you. And Taslima, the copy of the presentation will be available in the next day or two. We just have to do a few adjustments, but yes, we can make the copy available through Denise, the presentation.
Just want to go back to share. This one? Okay, sorry about that. I noticed that I had put a typo in my email address, so that wasn't going to work. I think there's a question in the... Here we go. Okay. Okay, other resources. So there's a question about more resources for occupational health and safety.
Sure. So a couple of things. Again, in the resource page of the comic, we list a number of sources, but one that I found really useful is the Institute for Work and Health. It's this amazing policy research and policy shop based in Toronto that has done tremendous cutting edge research on newcomers in occupational health and safety. And they're very eager to make connections with the settlement community. So for example, we're involved with some projects with them now to be able to connect our clients, to provide frontline contact with their researchers, but their information about occupational health and safety issues, policy, research are valuable. One of the things that they actually produce is a really good toolkit called Prevention is the Best Medicine. And it's a toolkit specifically designed to be incorporated, as we are doing here at Keys, into ESL classes to be able to help newcomers understand their OH&S rights and entitlements as part of their ESL experience. And I'll just share a little story. As a result of our work with Institute for Work and Health, they made a policy recommendation to the provincial government that the province, in funding agencies doing ESL, they should be incorporating OH&S entitlement and education through very specific means that our research had helped to develop. So I would encourage you to check out Institute for Work and Health, and I'm happy to facilitate a contact with some of their staff if that's useful.
And I think that, you know, the Institute for Work and Health is an amazing resource. The Prevention is the Best Medicine There are other resources, like Carl mentioned on the back of the comic, including the Workers' Action Center, the website stepstojustice.ca, which is a new resource put out by CLEO in collaboration with other organizations that has information on a number of different areas of the law, are other good resources. And for those of you who are working in employment and settlement organizations, I encourage you to consider, or not consider, but to hurriedly add information about occupational health and safety to your pre-employment training. As Carl mentioned, the former Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration, which is now part of another ministry, actually made occupational health and safety a mandatory component for all of the employment-related programs that they funded under for vulnerable newcomers, based on a call for proposals from 2 years ago. And they're going to be evaluating the quality of those interventions. So we're really excited to see that some of that policy shift happened. You know, we'll see what happens moving forward.
I would just add another afterthought, a very practical way to learn more about OH&S and to expand your resource base is to make contact with your local labor council. They will have an injured workers committee. And what we have done, and what I've done, I come from the union movement in my previous lives, is just making an overture to them and say, would you be willing to partner with us and conduct workshops on basic OH&S rights and entitlements? And very quickly, you will have tremendous expertise and resource from within your own community. And in exchange, some of those progressive union members will see the value in making that outreach and connection to newcomers who are going to be entering the workforce and who hopefully will become union members themselves. So that would be a very easy and practical way to expand your knowledge base without having to learn everything about OH&S on your own.
Now we've got a question from Masa about you know, what are some of the best ways for us to help our newcomer clients through the interview process? So not sure if you mean the general interview process or specific to the types of security interviews that some of our clients respond to. If you want to clarify, that would be helpful. In the meantime, in terms of specific to the security, okay, yeah.
Okay. So
thanks.
Yeah, so what we do in those particular cases is quite often our clients are unaware that they're going to be facing a security clearance protocol. And so the steps that we found is actually walking them through where this legislation came from, what it is people are looking for, and what the potential implications are. This is usually a very depressing moment with clients because they suddenly realize just how many more barriers are being placed in front of them. So the specific steps that I do is walk them through, for example, if it's an ITAR or enhanced reliability security, I walk them through the process. And then we do role playing about how they might be able to respond to some of those questions. Everything from, you know, the awkward question that an employer might ask, are you legally entitled to work in Canada? Or tell me about your dual citizenship. And then we give them coaching in terms of the correct answers that don't feed into a discriminatory decision, but also how to take note of what questions they're being asked and how they're being presented in order to better support a human rights complaint. But in order to get to those points, I think you can appreciate a client might be looking to be able to get the job that they want, as opposed to filing a complaint, which ultimately might end up barring them from ever working in the industry. And to be very clear, I mean, this is not an easy process. It literally, in one case, it has gone on for over 2.5 years, in which a client began the process, wanted to apply, was determined to overcome the barriers, only to realize that the nature of the systemic barriers were so severe that filing a complaint was the only option. And you literally have to just walk alongside with that individual through the process. We were fortunate to get one of Canada's top human rights lawyers to work pro bono on that case, which ultimately led us to conciliation and a level of remedy.
And I think, you know, just in terms of human rights, there are other human rights issues, of course, that come up in interview processes too. So I think it's really useful for us to, like Carl said, consider those in advance of when an individual might go for an interview. And sometimes, you know, we've talked about some security assessments that are based on, based in basically unjust legal frameworks. There are also issues that newcomers face in interviews that are more clearly against the law, specifically discrimination based on country of origin or based on family, based on Canadian experience. And I'd invite you to check out the work of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, especially with regards to the issue of Canadian experience, because this is one that's been kind of recently and hotly contested. And there are some connections between that and some of the security issues that basically the Human Rights Commission's position is that Canadian experience is not a valid requirement for a job, even though many, many employers require Canadian experience. So there are some other resources there too.
Corinne's question, where can we find specific information about the security assessments, the questions, the details of the process? Corinne, I would invite you to just send me a quick email at carlf@keys.ca. I've written quite a bit about some of these assessments, from enhanced reliability to ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, and I'm happy to share those specifics. It is not yet all compiled into a simple fact sheet, but your question does motivate me to think about taking some of the writing that I've done on these topics and turn it into a simpler fact sheet. So send me an email as a motivator for me to get that back to you.
And, you know, on a case-by-case basis, we've had, you know, if we're in a job development position or if we have a relationship with the employer, including the federal public service, you know, we can proactively ask, you know, what kinds of interview, what is the process? You don't have to say what is the security clearance process, but what are the steps that someone has to take in terms of the job, and that might elucidate security clearance issues that then can be asked more about.
And just to add to that, because it is a bit complex. There's marine transport, there's airport security, there's ITAR, which covers satellite and telecommunications, there's the federal public service, enhanced reliability, and there are variations of the security clearance on the provincial domain. So this is a good instigator for me to actually write these up in a one-pager with some broad pieces of information. Thanks for the homework.
So I think, not seeing any more questions, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future, and feel free to contact us with any further questions.
Yeah, we've got lots of the comic.
Bye-bye.